to see you and being involved in the band and everything there with the schedule of the freshmen and that he would continue to come here and to serve so faithfully. Colin, years ago, he's so embarrassed right now. He knows the spotlight. That's why, anyway. But I so appreciate it. It was a great opportunity this summer. You can talk to him about it. He'll be gone for the summer with Colin. Thanks, man.
Good morning.
Good morning, Gene.
Great to be back again. I tell you, when I walked in the door and I saw a bowl of candy on your little visitor table. These mean a lot to me. My grandma had these out on her coffee table every day of all the days that I was alive, that she was still alive, and so that really means a lot. And just, as a kid, it's such a great surprise to suck on these, which I never do. I chew everything, so to get to the soft strawberry scent, that means a lot. I have props today, so let's see if we can use those a little bit later. I'm going to tell you a story. So there was a Jewish man here in the United States that sent his son to Israel to study under one of the rabbis there, and while he was there, he became a Christian. And so his dad got very upset and said, I'm going to go talk to the rabbi. And so he went to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, you're not going to believe this, but the same thing happened to me. I sent my son to Israel to study, and he became a Christian. He said, let's get on our knees and pray to God. So they get on their knees and they say, God, the God of Isaac and Jacob, we come to you because we sent our kids to Israel, became a Christian, and God answers back, you're not going to believe this, but the same thing happened to me. You really somewhere during that story that wasn't quite true. And actually, I say that because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Jesus did not become a Christian. The early followers were not trying to start a new religion. They were just Jews who believed that the Messiah had come, and they stayed Jews. And it wasn't until Acts chapter 14 that it says they were first called Christians in Antioch. So I tell you that story because I think I'm gonna rock some of your file folder paradigms that you have maybe over the next 4 weeks, and just kind of maybe gently add a little bit of I don't think correction is quite the right word, but just realign some of the things that you have been thinking of probably most of your life that you've been following the Lord. To think about them in a different way. And I'm pretty sure that by the time I'm done in 4 weeks, you'll say, yes, this really makes sense. It lines up better. And some of this will make sense even today as I talk about the feasts and God's prophetic time clock. So I had this slide up when I was here on Easter. That's a picture of my book. And really, if the best way I can say what this book does, and I'm only mentioning it again because on Easter I talked about one of the chapters in the book, and today I'm talking about one of the chapters in the book. It's really the best way to think about it is if you went up in a drone and you were able to get kind of a drone's eye view of the entire story of God. You do realize we're stuck in a story, right? Okay. And you would come to this conclusion that it's not two stories, a Jewish story that then became a Christian story, but one beautiful, seamless story from beginning to end. Okay, I didn't realize that I get one view and you get another view. That's pretty cool. That's the same view that I have right here on my screen. I was thrown off by that, Cassandra. Oh my gosh. Okay. And it's important that you think of it this way, that it's one seamless story, beautiful love story from beginning to end. That's going to make more sense as we go on. A lot of people think of it as two different stories, like God started this story as a Jewish story, he put an end to it, and then the Christian story started. That's really not how it plays out. Okay, speaking of stories, everyone loves a great story, don't they? Don't you?
Yes.
I do. But have you ever wondered why we love great stories? And maybe one of your stories is up here, but you might think about what's your favorite story. It doesn't have to be a book or a movie. It could be a musical or a song. But we all love great stories. And we like particular kinds of stories. Ones that are kind of like this, where it begins where you start with the main characters. And you can go to the next slide here. And the idea of everyone who writes a story is for you to connect with the people who are the key players in the story, right? And that's how most great stories start, because you don't become kind of emotionally connected, you're not going to feel what's going on later on. And in almost all of these great stories, particularly the ones that we call hero themes, something happens somewhere in this story where the bad guy shows up, right? And something happens to the main characters. And that's when the dark music starts playing, and they're either taken, captive in some way, kidnapped, or something happens to them. That gives rise for a hero to come and save the day and defeat the bad guy. And of course, that scene that we love the most is where they ride up into the sunset to live happily ever after, and we get our Kleenex bottle and the tissues out. That's what we love. And I don't know if you ever thought about this, but all those great stories, and most of the stories are hero themed. I mean, there's some really dark and twisted stories. We won't go into those. Most of the stories, songs, where something happens, breaks your heart, a hero comes right up into the sunset to live happily ever after. All of these, I call those smaller stories. They are smaller stories of the big story, the story that God wrote, the story that you and I are stuck in. Once upon a time, God wrote a story. And I call it the big story, the story above all the other stories, the meta-narrative. And the reason why men and women throughout the ages continue to write these stories over and over again is because whether they believe in God or not, God's story is in our DNA. And we can't help ourselves. That over and over and over again, we write these same storylines. The characters change, the times of which they take place change, the situations change, but it's always the same thing. Connected to the main characters, something bad happens, the hero shows up, defeats the evil villain, right up into the sunset to live happily ever after. True?
True.
All right. So one of the verses I love that supports this idea is in Isaiah chapter 46. And here's what it says. It says, remember the former things of long ago. Well, Isaiah is already long ago, right? So he's looking back to the beginning. Even maybe before the beginning. You realize that when God wrote this story, he's sitting in eternity past, and he's thinking, I need someone to love on. And so I'm going to write a story. And Genesis 1:1 is where he presses the play button, and that story starts. And he says, remember the former things of long ago. So he's either going back to the beginning or even into eternity past here. I am God, there is no other. I am God, there is none like me. In other words, this is my story. It's not your story. You didn't write the story. This is my story. And he says, I make known the end from the beginning. Isn't that interesting the way Isaiah says this? Usually we say, I make known the beginning to the end. But what he's saying here is at the beginning of this story, I'm going to tell you how it ends. I make known the end from the beginning. From ancient times, what is still to come. And I say, my purpose will stand. I'll do all that I please. I'm the author of this story. From the east, if I need a bird to push my story down the road a little bit, I'll use a bird. From a far-off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. If I need a human being to fulfill my purposes, I will use a human being to get my story down the road. Because what I have said, that I will bring about, and what I have planned, that I will do. One thing you can take to the bank, God's story will play out the way He wrote it. Now, I don't know how it works, because I believe in free will, and I believe in predestination, because they're both in the Bible. Somehow or another, you and I choose what we want to do. But in the end, God blows in our life in such a way that when we choose it, God goes, you know it. Okay. So let's go on. How many of you have ever been to a 3D movie? Okay. Most of us at least know about it, right? And so you have to wear special glasses. What happens if you don't wear the glasses? Yeah, if you're like me that has really severe motion sickness, it's not pretty. But it's blurry. You can't really see things. Well, the same thing's true for God's story. You can try kind of make it out, but you need special glasses. Well, some people read God's story with these kinds of glasses. And I call them no resolution glasses because what happens if you go to a movie and you come into the movie, you leave the movie halfway through. You don't know how it ends, right? And so that's what happens with these glasses. So there's no resolution. You don't know how the story resolves. And so some people wear these glasses, all right. Some people read God's story with only these glasses on. Now what happens if you go to a movie and you come in halfway through it? You don't know where you're at, right? You have no context. So you're elbowing somebody next to you going, what's going on? What's going on? And unfortunately, there's a lot of us who only have these glasses on, and we don't know where we're at. And when you don't know where you're at, you make things up, or you guess. You just guess. And unfortunately, we have guessed a lot throughout history, and guess what? We've guessed wrong. Okay. And that'll come out a little bit more. Okay, in order to read God's story properly, you've got to have these glasses on. And I call these connecting the dots.
You got the wrong glasses on.
Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Use your hair. There we go. Connecting the dots glasses. And so with these, you're able to see God's story as one beautiful seamless story from beginning to end. Everything makes sense. There's not a disconnection. There's not discontinuity in the story. It all flows perfectly. And that's what we're going to explore over the next 4 weeks. So in this book, I cover what I call 7 foreshadows. Foreshadow is something that happens in the past that is a picture of something that will happen in the future. And these particular foreshadows is the role that the Jewish people play in God's story throughout the entire story, not just the first half, but through the second half and into the third episode. I guess I made it in halves. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, but you got the Old Testament period, the New Testament period, and you got New Jerusalem, which is the third episode. And I think in Easter, I covered the covenant. You all remember that. And today I'm going to cover the feast. But these all follow a very logical, progressive pattern, okay? And it begins with a covenant. The covenant, as you learned on Easter, is about a marriage. And of course, once you have a marriage, you're going to have kids. That leads to the nation of Israel. That's the family. Once you have a marriage and a family, you need a place to live. That's the promised land. That's the family home. Every smart family has a good set of healthy rules. So you have a marriage, you have a family, you have a family home. Now you need a set of rules to live by. That's the law, or the Torah, as it's really called in the Old Testament. And then the temple is the next one. The temple is access to God, access to Dad. If you remember, the temple starts out where God's in the back room called the Holy of Holies. It's kind of a distant relationship, but over these 3 episodes, it gets better and better and better. And so every smart father knows that he gives his kids and his spouse plenty of access to him, and that's what the temple foreshadow is about. That leads to the 6th one, which is the Sabbath. Sabbath is what? A 24-hour period of ceasing from your work. Most people think that you cease, you get up like, you climb up on the couch and you take a 24-hour siesta. It's based off of God creating for 6 days and resting on the 7th. And did God climb up on the couch? He's been taking an eternal nap ever since? No, he's managing the universe and the story. And so the Sabbath is actually about not ceasing from everything, but being more purposeful about what you do in those 24 hours, okay? And then the feasts, which we're going to cover today, are absolutely amazing. God's story, as I told you, plays out like a trilogy. Maybe you've seen a trilogy, you've read a trilogy before. Lord of the Rings is just one of those. But it's based off, in my mind, it's based off this passage in Revelation 4:8 where it says, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And so we have in the first episode the God who was in the past. These are the prophetic pictures of the past. The God who is today and has been since Jesus came. These are the messianic fulfillments of these foreshadows in the present, but we still got one more episode to go, right? We're looking, this is what we're hopeful for. This is why we show up every Sunday.
Right.
Because it's going to get, no, it's going to get perfect. You just want better? I hope not. I've had better, and I've had worse. I don't want perfect. Okay. And so that's the God who is to come. By the way, just a little bonus, that last song, I can't remember what the phrase was, but we said, oh, I am, right? We said that over and over again. It comes out of that chapter in Exodus when Moses says, who should I say is sending me, right? Tell him I am. And Jesus uses that phrase several times. It comes from the Hebrew verb to be. It's where we get the kind of the unspoken word of God. Many people try to pronounce it Jehovah or Yahweh or Yahweh. The truth is we don't know how to pronounce it because Jews wouldn't pronounce it. And so Hebrew doesn't have vowels. And so if there's no vowel markings along the way, you can pronounce it all different kinds of ways. So Jews, they don't even try to pronounce it. It's just Yud, the letters Yud, He, Vav, He. But Yud, He, Vav, He is like, well, what is that? That Hebrew word actually has past and present and future language features. All in those 4 letters, where we get Jehovah, Yahweh. And so that word actually means the God who was and is and will be. Okay, that wasn't in my notes. Let's look at the feasts. The feasts are the family reunions. They're absolutely amazing. You're probably going to come up to me and say, how come I've been a believer for, 70 years and I never heard this? And my answer to that question is, I don't know. Okay. Actually, I do know. I'll cover that next week. There's a reason why you don't know this. And it's sad that you don't know this. It begins with, in the first episode in the Old Testament, as the crop, gathering of the crops. In the second episode, when Jesus shows up, it's the gathering of the souls. And when we get to New Jerusalem, it's the gathering of the eternal family. All right? And I call it God's prophetic clock because each of these 7 feasts that I'm going to talk about today tell us specifically where we're at in God's prophetic timetable. But it's even more than that. Because each of these 7 feasts, and I want you to pay attention to this as I cover these, all 7 of these feasts cover a very specific major event in the Messianic era that we live in today. And it's not that it's close or in the ballpark, right? There's a lot of people that write about prophecy and they say they can't give you times and things like that. These happen in the exact time of major events. And I want you to pay attention to that as we go along, all right? So in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4, and Leviticus chapter 23 is where we get all these 7 feasts, including the Sabbath, okay? But that's once a week. These are once a year, and that's the ones I'm covering. It says, these are the Lord's appointed feasts. That Hebrew word there is moedim, all right? It literally means appointed times. And so you see that in the second half of this verse, appointed times. They both are the same word, appointed times. These are the Lord's appointed times, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times, right? So there's a mystery to these. These are appointed times. That's why it's so important to know this is God's prophetic time clock. This is why I call them in the book 7 mysteries you might have missed. All right? You're not going to miss them today. You're going to get these. And they are so amazing. By the way, a lot of people call these the Jewish feasts. But what are they called here? The Lord's feasts. Right? Okay. How many in this room follow the Lord? Okay. These are your feasts too. They've completely dropped off the radar screen for most of Christianity's history because we don't do that, right? And did some of you do a Passover Seder just this month? Yeah. And wasn't it amazing?
Yeah.
Hear about how these things evolved, and they have so many things that, as a Jewish person who's not a believer, and that's not me, but if you're a Jewish who's not a believer, the last thing you want to do is put Jesus into the Passover Seder, and yet somehow it's just littered with these pictures, okay? And that makes it more amazing. So the Lord tells Moses, this kind of dropped off the radar screen too, that he tells Moses that the first day of your year, your calendar year, falls in the spring. And I'll show you that verse in just a minute. Okay, so the very first feast that comes follows winter. And if you think about winter, things are dormant, things are dead, and it's, metaphorically speaking, and just physically speaking too, but metaphorically speaking, it's like today, but wasn't it hard to get up today and put on a jacket? I noticed some of you didn't even try. It's like, I'm not going there, right? Because winters can be hard, particularly, it's not that hard for us. We've got alfalfas and, King Supers just down the street. We can survive, right? But winters, it's like, will we have enough food to make it? Will we have enough fuel to make it? It's hard. And so it's important to see that God told Moses, I want your first day of the calendar year to be in spring. Because every year, you're going to be looking forward to something. What? Well, when spring comes, it's like, we made it. We're saved, right? And things start coming out of the ground. You see, I love going down South Boulder Road and seeing all the calves that are born. And it just reminds you that life is coming. Well, that's what these 7 feasts are an odd mix of spiritual and agrarian observances. And you got to ask the question, why would God do that? And so here they are, up on the chart. There's 7 of them. There's that verse. This month, Nisan happens, they follow a lunar calendar, and so Nisan happens sometime around mid-March or so. Right in the sweet spot of winter is ending and spring is coming. You have that battle, sometimes before it fully emerges, but you're going to make it now. All right. And here's the 7 of them. I'm going to go through, I'm going to tell you all 7 of them, and then I'm going to look at how they are fulfilled. Okay, so it begins with Passover. It's no coincidence that God chose Passover as the first feast in the springtime. What does Passover celebrate? The redemption of the Jewish people out of slavery in Egypt. And of course, it starts with the story that every Jewish person was to mark their door with the blood of the sacrificed lamb. And if they were to mark their doorposts, tops and bottoms, the angel of death would pass over. It's so simple. That's what that word means. The angel of death passes over. So what we have is an English version of the word Pesach. That's what it is in Hebrew, to pass over. And that's the very first feast. It's only one day. The very next day is the second feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Hag HaMatzot is how you say it in Hebrew. And of course, what does that celebrate? It celebrates the fact that in this feast of Passover, we get rid of anything that causes bread to rot. Most of it's yeast, but there's a lot of other things that happen. And so the Jews were commanded by God to get rid of any leaven in their households. Today in Israel, and a lot of times here in the United States, it's a mad frenzy week before where people go into their homes and they lift the cushions off their couch. They look at the soy sauce and you find, oh my gosh, it's in soy sauce, and you get rid of it. And a lot of families take it outside and they burn the whole thing. In Israel, sometimes we had one of my tours that were over Passover. We had to leave the hotel because that was the day they were going to get rid of their. You were on that tour, okay? And we had to go to another hotel for one night. And the reason why the hotels do this, because there's a lot of families, if you can afford it, that don't want to do that for a whole week, so they go stay in a hotel. And they let the hotels do it for them. All right, that lasts for a week. At the end of that week comes the third feast called First Fruits. Yom HaBikurim is how you say it in Hebrew. It's early first fruits because there's a latter-day first fruits that's coming next. There's only one command about when to observe this in Leviticus 23, and you are to observe this the day after the Sabbath that falls during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, during Passover. Okay? So for those of you who know this, what day does the Sabbath fall on? What day of the week for us? Saturday. So this would be, it would fall on the day after, which would be Sunday. Okay? And so the instructions are that the Jewish farmers would take the first sprigs of, probably would be barley at this point, maybe some wheat, but maybe mostly barley. Take those first sprigs out of the ground, go to the temple, and give it to the high priest, and the high priest would make a wave offering. The idea behind it is that if God is faithful to bring this first fruit out of the ground, early first fruits, He will be faithful to bring the rest of the harvest later on. It's a blessing that God will bless this harvest and we will have a good harvest, in about 50 days. All right. Some of you are already thinking and connecting the dots here.
Yeah.
But we're going to really connect them in just a little bit. Okay, that leads to the fourth feast, the Feast of Weeks. In Hebrew, it's called Shavuot. You will recognize this feast because it's in your Bible. It's just not called Shavuot or the Feast of Weeks. It's found in Acts chapter 22. It's called, anyone know? Pentecost. Yeah. Shavuot means literally weeks. It's the Hebrew word for weeks. Pentecost means 50. And so this is true because after early first fruits, the Jewish people traditionally start counting down 50 days to the Feast of Weeks. There's a prayer that you say, and then you end it by saying Yom Echad, day one. Then you say the prayer the next day, and then you'll say Yom Sheni, day 2. All right? And you do this for 50 days. It's a countdown. What is the Feast of Weeks? I'm giving to you in this purest sense because today the Jewish world, and honestly some of the Christian world, celebrate this as the giving of the Torah. And it did take Moses 50 days from Passover to get to Mount Sinai, and that's cool. That's a whole nother message I could give, but we won't go there. The purest thing about Shavuot is that it's an agrarian festival celebrating what? The beginning of the grain harvest, the physical harvest. All right? Okay. Once this feast is over, and you get to day 49, day 50, let's harvest. There's no feast during summer. Why? Yeah, it's harvest time, and you don't celebrate during harvest time. You work, because if you don't work, you don't eat, right? Whole Foods hadn't been started yet in Israel, and so you got to work for the harvest. Any farmers here? No? Oh, come on. All right. If you're farming, you know all about this. Okay, at the end of the summer begins the fifth feast, which is Yom Teruah, which is the feast of blowing. And so it's the commandment in Leviticus 23 is to blow. It says trumpets, feast of trumpets. It's really not trumpets. Yom Teruah means the feast of blowing. That's literally what it means. And they're to blow the shofar all day long. Let's see if I can get it on here. My lips are kind of dry. I did drink my water. This blows all day long on that feast. All right? What is it celebrating? Remember, think agrarian here. What happens then? It's the end of the grain harvest. There'll be figs and olives and things like that coming later, but the grain harvest is officially over. Okay? And when it's over, you'd think there'd be a lot of excitement, right? Like, wow, look at the bounty God has given us. But no, God inserts this spiritual observation called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it's very sobering, right? In fact, it's so sobering that the 10 days between the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of, or not the feast, but the Day of Atonement are the 10 of the most sacred days in the year of a Jewish person. They're called the Days of Awe because Jewish people only have that God will forgive their sins once a year, on the Day of Atonement. And if he doesn't, their name doesn't get written into the book of life for that next year. And so most of what happens, particularly on the Day of Atonement, back in today, I'll just talk about today, is that you'll see Jews, most of them are renting churches because their synagogues don't have enough space. It's like what I compare it to Easter, right? Everyone comes out. Even atheists come out on that day. And the prayers are to God, put my name in the book of life for next year. Okay. Weird insertion right there. Why wouldn't we just go right to the celebration? But after the Day of Atonement comes the last feast called the Feast of Booths, Sukkot in Hebrew. Sukkot is the plural word for booth. So it's the Feast of Booths, where Jews are commanded to eat and sleep in these man-made structures that have a view up all the way to the stars, really up to heaven. And they decorate their booths with things like wheat and the bounty of what you find in a harvest time, fruits and things like that. Okay? And it's a picture. It's a picture. It creates pictures. All these create pictures. So let me go through and tell you quickly about how these are fulfilled. Notice again that it's not the day before, and it's not the day after, and in some cases it's a specific time of day, as you'll see in the Passover here, that fulfill a major event in this Messianic era. We start with the Passover. Jesus was crucified on the Passover. Now, if you've never thought about this, it's not a coincidence that Jesus was crucified on the Passover. The day that celebrates, observes God redeeming the Jewish people from slavery, the day that they would celebrate the slaughter of the perfect, blameless, spotless lamb, take some of its blood, mark their doorposts, the angel of death would pass over them, and so Jesus was crucified. Now here's the part. There was a particular window of time, of day, that the lambs were crucified in the temple on Passover. It was between 2 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. All of you Bible scholars, when did Jesus take his last breath? 3 o'clock. It was 3 in the afternoon, right in the sweet spot. So in this particular case, it's not even just the day, it's the hour. I mean, it's right in that sweet spot, okay? And this is why 1 Corinthians